I introduced these two concepts of low Christology and high Christology, which is mostly because I will probably use those terms a little bit as we keep going. We will address the can both things be true in even more detail as we go forward. We also talked about the use of the word monogenes, specifically in John 3, but several places in the New Testament, and how that gets referenced back to Psalm 2 and specifically the 7th verse of Psalm 2, where it talks about God saying, "You are my son, today have I begotten you," and how that gets used several places in the New Testament. So we'll be coming back to this for sure a little later on. But today, I want to look at something a little more specific that kind of gets to the idea of not the Christology of Jesus, but Jesus's Christology. Jesus talking about Christology himself. There is a trajectory in the Gospels that this chart exemplifies to some degree. You can break Christ's life on earth into all sorts of different pieces, but these are three fairly broad pieces that you commonly see. And it kind of shows you where the emphasis is. So, the birth and childhood period of Jesus' life was how long? 30 years, because his ministry didn't start, if you take what Luke says, until he was about 30. So you've got 30 years of Christ's life on earth. Jesus' life on earth was described in one chapter in 2 books for 30 years. Then on the other end, the Passion story is only 7 days long, but it's roughly a third of all the books, of each book. So those 7 days were very important compared to the first 30 years. You see how that kind of bears out in the texts. And so there's this chunk in the middle, which is, as it says here, the ministry chunk, where he's traveling mostly in Galilee, teaching, and then eventually makes his way to Jerusalem for the Passion Week. So there's this trajectory moving toward the Passion, toward the crucifixion and resurrection. And what we're going to be talking about today happens right on the cliff here, right before it goes from ministry to Passion. At the very end of the ministry, the end of the teaching ministry. So I just kind of want you to get a feel for where we are in the story. It's right before we get committed to the Passion. We get committed to the Jerusalem last week. And it's going to take place in Caesarea Philippi. These 3 accounts in the Synoptics, all 3 of them tell this story. And so Jesus is taking his disciples to Caesarea Philippi. Caesar Augustus, when he became Caesar, the first great Caesar, he put Herod the Great in charge of Israel. And Herod the Great built a city for him, Caesarea Maritima. So it's not Caesarea Philippi, but it's Caesarea Maritima. It was built on the coast. So he just went where there wasn't anything and built a city in honor of Caesar. And I'll come back to him in just a minute, but his son Philip did the same thing, but it was inland in what today is the Golan Heights. It's actually Syria, but Israel has possession of it from time to time. But that's where That's what we'll be talking about today. Is Caesarea Philippi that Herod's son Philip built for Caesar, where there wasn't a city. Just went out and built a city for Caesar. And so that's where we're going with this. There is a temple in this location that Herod the Great built, that Philip's father built before he died. But it wasn't the city. It was outside the city. That's what we're going to be talking about here. Here are the ruins, the excavations of Caesarea Philippi, right here, down here in this area. What we're going to be talking about is up here in this area. And if you read what this, if you can read what that says the temple of Pan and the dancing goats. It's called Paneas because it was named for the god, the Greek god Pan. It wasn't a town, but it's just this place, Paneas. Now you will, in modern day, you will hear it called Buneas because there is not a P sound in Arabic. So they say Buneas instead of Paneas. So this cliff face here, this cliff face is what we're going to be talking about. And you get a little closer and you can see there's a hole in the wall. That's a cave. We've talked about this cave before when we were talking about life after death. Because you remember that these caves, these large caves that were very deep, were considered entrances to heaven, entrances to hell. In the mythologies of the past, whether Greek, Roman, or Jewish, these caves would be entrances to the underworld, to Sheol or Hades. And so that was the belief here. Now, you see this large amount of water running through here. It's just coming right out of the ground. So it's a large amount of water. It's actually more or less the beginning of the Jordan River. Pops out of the ground right here, and then goes all the way down to the Dead Sea. There was a big earthquake in 1033, so a little over 1,000 years ago, and the roof of this cave caved in just a little bit. Actually changed the geology there and closed off what was the water coming out of the cave, because this water used to come out of the cave. It would bubble up in the cave and come out. When that happened, it found a way out over here. It is believed that there was actually even more water before that happened, but there's still a significant flow of water here, as you can see. Now, because that cave was what it was, it became sacred, and people started doing sacrifices at the cave and that sort of thing. So this is larger. Remember, the opening is larger now than it used to be because the top fell in and made it larger during that earthquake. But it's fairly deep, and it has a pool of water in it because the water used to come out there. So they would offer sacrifices, mostly goats. Thus, that's why it's one of the names involves dancing goats. That came after the time of Christ, but they would offer sacrifices. They would throw the sacrifice in the water in the cave, and if the turbulence in the water in the cave swallowed the goat, your sacrifice was accepted. And so this was mostly a Greek-based system. So they're worshiping the god Pan. Pan, you've probably seen pictures of. If you don't know what Pan looked like, he was from waist down a goat, and from waist up a human form. That's why the goats are involved here. At the time Jesus was taking his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, that temple I was telling you about that Herod built for Caesar Augustus was right here, right in front of the cave. And the water came out of the cave, and went through the temple to get to the cave once he had built this temple. So, for a long time there was no temple, and so they just used the cave in its original form. And then Herod built this temple to Caesar, and then there may have been another small temple over here at the time. It was built in the 1st century at some point. Whether or not it was built before Jesus or after Jesus is a little bit involved in speculation, so it's not for certain either way. This is traditionally because the New Testament is not specific enough for us to know. But traditionally, what we're going to be looking at today, the episode we're going to be looking at today, takes place here, at this location. Specifically because there's a reference that Jesus makes here to the gates of hell. And why was this called the gates of hell? Because the cave was an entrance to hell, to Hades. Perhaps because he's in Caesarea Philippi and he makes a reference to the gates of hell, that's what puts us at this location. But it's not for certain. I tend to shy away from certainty on this kind of thing because we don't know for sure. As an example, does anybody here watch The Chosen? When I was looking up some references that I was looking up on one of the things I'm going to talk about later, I noticed that they had just recently done an episode of The Chosen that portrayed this episode that we're going to be looking at in the scriptures here. So here you have Jesus standing in front of the sacrificial altar, and that big temple's on this side, and the small temple's on this side, and here he is talking to his disciples. And having watched that scene, I'm actually more inclined to go back and watch the series because I think they did a really good job with it, as close as you can get to what's going on. So Jesus talks when they walk up to this, and Jesus is, and as we get into this, the topic will make some sense to you. But the disciples are saying, Jesus, why did you bring us to this place where they're sacrificing goats to the god Pan? This is a place we should not be. We don't get that in the scripture, but you can imagine that being the situation. This is not a place that the Jews who were just trying to be good Jews would go. Okay? But so it was very accurately done, I think, through the most part of what they did. One thing I found interesting is I saw a guy, Jesus glanced, right before Jesus started talking, he glanced at one of the disciples, and it was a signal for him to take out his pad and paper and start taking notes. That was really interesting to me. And I almost immediately knew who that was. So I'll tell you that story too. And I went back and looked, and that's who it is. It's Matthew, because Matthew was the tax collector, and he was the one that was, interested in all the details and that kind of thing. So Jesus had him taking notes. That's what they've done here in The Chosen. But there's a backstory to that, and I got intrigued by that, so I had to look to see if the producers of the show had ever mentioned this. They haven't. I don't know if they've made this connection or not, but there's actually a backstory in that Papias, we've talked about Papias before, he wrote right at the end of the first century. He was in the generation that actually knew the apostles. He's one of the first people that wrote about Jesus and the apostles that we have any information from that wasn't actually a gospel writer. He's considered to be a little bit untrustworthy because of some of the stories that he tells. For example, he says that Judas, when he tried to hang himself, was stopped, that somebody saved him. Because there's the conflicting story between Matthew and Luke about how Judas died. Matthew says he hanged himself, and and Luke says he exploded. What Papias says is that somebody saved him from hanging, and he went on about his life, and he lived for years after that. But he became excessively large, so large that he couldn't walk down a street wide enough for a chariot. And even his head got so large it wouldn't fit. And his eyes, you couldn't see his eyes, and he couldn't see out. And he eventually did explode because of that. So Papias is not considered to be a completely accurate representative of the truth. But he does say, he talks about the books of the New Testament. He mentions a gospel written by Matthew in Hebrew, which doesn't exist, because the gospel that we have of Matthew is Greek, and it was written in Greek. You can tell by the structure of it. It wasn't written in Hebrew and translated into Greek. So that also goes along with the notion that Matthew's taking notes in Hebrew, Aramaic. That was something that actually did exist. But again, Papias is not 100% trustworthy, so we don't know if that really was the case or not. Okay, well, all this is set up to get us to our story here. Matthew 16, Mark 8, and Luke 9 all tell the story of Jesus taking his disciples to Caesarea Philippi and asking them a question. Now, Matthew obviously has the most extensive account here. He's got this chunk in the middle that nobody else has. So that's the one we're going to use. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. So here Jesus is asking them, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And so their answer first is John the Baptist, which is an interesting answer because John the Baptist has only been dead probably for a few months, not more than a year or so. So they actually in that scene of the chosen kind of laugh when they say that because obviously Jesus is 30 some years old and John's only been dead for a year. So that one seems a little odd to everyone, but I'll show you something about that. King Herod hears about Jesus, and so when Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known, this is Mark 6, some said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him, but others said he is Elijah, and others said he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. So this was apparently one of those things that was out there with the whole idea of John the Baptist. So there's John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. That's the answer that the disciples give Jesus about who do other people say he is. So why were they saying he was Elijah? The main reason they were using the idea of Elijah, now, of course, they all pretty much it was all pretty much agreed with Jesus' fame and what he was famous for, that he could be considered a prophet, like the prophets of old. But they were very specific about Elijah. Why Elijah? Well, because of the prophecies in Malachi that are often used of John the Baptist, and so specifically in Malachi 3:1, behold, I send my messenger, he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. And then in the next chapter, he says, remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. So there was this prophecy there that all the people who were interested in prophecy, obviously the leaders of the Jewish leaders, but even the common people knew that there was this prophecy before anything big could happen at the end, Elijah had to return. So they're taking this very literally that Elijah is the one that returns. Now remember, Jesus ultimately ends up telling the disciples that John the Baptist fulfilled this role. But then just to go one layer of the onion deeper, a lot of people talk about the witnesses in the book of Revelation that come and preach, and the two people in the Old Testament that have never died, Enoch and Elijah, are those two witnesses because they have to die. Everybody has to die. So that's the way that gets explained. So, but there is this whole idea that Elijah has to come before the end. So everybody knew that. So that's why they thought the crowds would say that Jesus was Elijah, preparing the way of God at the end. So that's why you get the answers that you get from the crowd. In our day, you can kind of think of us as the crowd. We want to explain who this is, and that's That's what was the response of the disciples there. After that, Jesus says to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ," which means what? You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And again, if he's the Messiah, and you remember Psalm 2, in Psalm 2, God talks about the Messiah as his son. So that makes that connection. So you are the Christ, the Son that's different from all the other sons of the living God. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." And so Jesus says plainly to Simon, "You're not smart enough to figure this out for yourself. You got this from my Father in heaven." So this declaration here that Jesus makes says that my Father says I'm the Messiah. Okay? So who is Jesus? According to this, Jesus is the Messiah. Okay? So we know that one for sure. Now, when Jesus started this in the book of Matthew, he didn't call himself the Messiah. What did he call himself? He said, who do the people say that the Son of Man is? So there's two titles here that you need to pay attention to. All right? All right, let's go ahead and finish this. "And I tell you, you are Peter," changes his name, "and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." When we get to the very end of this whole discussion of Christology, we're going to come back to this verse. Okay? But he tells Peter that I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Now, "you" is a hard word. Why? How many people are in the word "you"? It can be one, or it can be everyone. So that's why "you" becomes a hard word every time you see it. So I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind, whatever you loose. Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Messiah. So God told Peter that Jesus was the Messiah, and Jesus tells everyone not to tell anyone what God told them. Okay? So the Messiah has come. That's a big deal. Don't tell anybody. Seems a bit odd, does it not? Okay? Verse 21, "From that time Jesus began." So we haven't, and this they all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all say this. From that time. So this is the point. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, because now he's back to being Peter. He's not listening to God anymore. "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Now, that's an important context. That's an important point. Why is Peter saying this will never happen to you? Now, we have this whole emotional connection that, Peter, this is his friend and he's not going to let this happen. But there's another reason that Peter is saying this can never happen to you.
They think that he's going to be a war leader.
He's the Messiah. If you read the whole Old Testament, you will not find anywhere that it says the Messiah will come and die. What the Messiah does is come and take over the world. So if Jesus is the Messiah, he can't go to Jerusalem and die. So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you, because you're the Messiah." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. If Jesus said this now, remember there's no context for the disciples about him dying on the cross because he hasn't died on the cross. So, and he's not specifically telling them that he's going to die on the cross before this point. So he's telling them they have to take up their cross and follow him. And then verse 27, for the Son of Man, so here we have the Son of Man again. The Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. This is immediately before the transfiguration. So they are at the foot of the mountain where the transfiguration likely occurred. So here we have that. So we have here in verse 13 and verse 16 of Matthew, and both Mark and Luke also have this connection with the Son of Man and the Christ. We have two different identities here of Jesus, the Son of Man and the Messiah. In these accounts, you have Son of Man, Christ, Christ, Son of Man, Christ, Son of Man. So they both do this. They all three do this. We see it in the book of John as well. So we're going to focus on these two things because they're not the same thing. And they both have different elements of this involved. Why was Jesus crucified? Now I'm not asking a spiritual question here. I'm asking a practical question. Men, Jews and Romans, depending on your perspective, killed Jesus. They crucified Jesus. Why did they crucify Jesus?
Blasphemy.
Get him out of the picture.
They said he called himself God.
Then he strictly charged his disciples to tell no one he was the Messiah. Who's the Messiah for the Jews? Well, we've already kind of answered that question. If you kill somebody who says they're the Messiah, are they the Messiah?
No.
So if they get rid of Jesus, they don't have to worry about him being the Messiah because they couldn't kill the Messiah. You see that reasoning there. The Romans killed Jesus because he was the Messiah too. Because who is the Messiah? The leader. The king of the Jews. And who's the king? Not a Jewish guy. The guy in Rome is the king. And so if you go around saying you're the king, we'll make an example of you. And that's what they did from the Roman perspective. So in both cases, Jesus was killed for being the Messiah. The principal excuse that we often get from the Gospels perspective that we kind of put on the Gospels is that Jesus didn't want anybody to know he was the Christ because then the people would rise up and, want him to be the military leader and take over and get rid of Rome. But the other good explanation for why you don't go around saying Jesus is the Messiah is because it will get you killed. Okay? He goes around saying, and this is what we're going to get into. He goes around saying the Son of Man, the Son of Man, the Son of Man. He's not afraid to use that term in front of people. But he doesn't ever say, hey, look, I'm the Messiah. Because that gets you killed. The Son of Man doesn't. Which, again, draws a distinction between those two identities. So we'll talk about those two things as we move on from here next week.